Okay, so this next unit, effective dose, this is the last of the 4 units before we sort of put it all into context. This last unit tells you that, fantastic, you know what the entrance skin exposure is, because you can measure it with a Geiger counter or other radiation detector. You know what the absorbed dose is, because we say there's a one-to-one relationship between exposure and absorbed dose, okay? And if it's X-rays you're dealing with, you know what the dose equivalent is. There's a one-to-one relationship between absorbed dose and dose equivalent. Great, but you didn't tell me what type of tissue the X-rays were going to interact with, okay? Once you know that, you can know what's called the effective dose. So we know how much harm is going to be caused by knowing the dose equivalent. Adding on this next factor is going to tell you, in all actuality, how much harm will be caused based on the radiosensitivity of different tissues. Now you should know there's basically 4 types of tissues in the body. Can anyone most of you taking medical assisting, what are the 4 types of tissue that we have? What are your bones made of? What kind of tissue would you call your bones? And your ligaments and your tendons and cartilage? Your bones aren't muscle. What do ligaments do? They do what, though? Good. So if you wanted to call it a type of tissue, you'd call it connective tissue, because it connects things, right? Bones, ligaments, tendons, cartilage are all connective tissue. That's one type of tissue in your body, okay? There is also muscular tissue, okay? So you have connective and muscular. You have nervous tissue, and you have, I don't know, most of you have skin, right? Yeah, most of us. And the inside of our body has linings, right? Our intestines have linings. Our organs have inner and outer linings, right? All of that type of tissue is called epithelial tissue. Okay, so those are your 4 tissue types: nervous, muscular, connective, and epithelial, and in no special order. Okay. These different tissue types have different amounts of radiosensitivity. Now we're going to go into depth in this in upcoming lectures in the next couple modules, but what you should know is that, as I said, certain tissues are more sensitive than others, and it has to do with how mitotically active the tissue is. What is mitosis? Cell division, right? Cells dividing and making daughter cells. If a cell, what needs to happen for a cell to mitose? What needs to happen for a cell to split into 2 new cells? Like, no, you don't have to tell me the whole process, but what, broadly speaking, needs to happen to make one thing into 2 things? Yeah, but it doesn't just split in half, right? If you just split in half, you know we have 46 chromosomes in our DNA, right? If you just split them in half, now you got 23 on each side, right? That would be half of a cell on each side. So what do you need to do to everything in the cell to make one cell into 2 cells? Reproduce it, copy it, right? Make an exact copy, right? And that's what cells do, right? They take themselves and they copy themselves and then split apart. Okay? That's mitosis, roughly speaking. Okay? That copying process, if it happens faster, that makes the cell more sensitive to radiation. The faster a cell reproduces, that makes it more sensitive to radiation. What do you know about mitosis in nerve cells? Neurons. They do not regenerate. So putting into our terminology, nerve cells are amitotic. Nerve cells do not mitose. They don't divide. That's why if you break your neck and lacerate your spinal cord, then everything from that laceration point down is no longer going to receive nerve impulses, because the nervous tissue doesn't regenerate, right? Doesn't regrow. Okay, so good. That's one special thing, is that when a cell is more active, more actively dividing, it's more sensitive to radiation. Okay, where in your body are you going to have cells rapidly dividing?
Your skin, for example.
Skin cells. That's a good example. Good.
So you're always shedding, it's
Yep.
always coming back.
Good.
Blood cells regenerate, so in your bones.
So blood cells regenerate if they're red cells, it's 3 months, right? 120, excuse me, 4 months, right? 30, yeah, 4 months, right? Good. And what about your gonads, right? Males specifically, right? Males are continuously creating sperm, right? Females are continuously regenerating an ova for the 28-day ovulation cycle, ovarian cycle. So the gonads are very, very active, but your nervous tissue, not very active at all. Okay, so we would say something like, so the effect of, so by the way, when you have ever had an x-ray taken, or have you ever taken x-rays, if you're out doing x-rays at your clinic right now, do we put shields over the head to shield the nervous system? Or do we put shields over the gonads to shield the gonads? So just from that, you can infer what's more sensitive, right? The stuff that we're covering is the more sensitive stuff. The gonads are more sensitive than the nervous tissue. The gonads are more sensitive than bone. Bone is connective tissue, and connective tissue has a very slow division rate. So one, the amount of the rate of mitosis affects how radiosensitive tissues will be. The second thing is, and again, we're going to do this in depth in the proper lecture, but the second important thing to remember is that the level of differentiation, the level of specialization matters. Okay, cells in your body start off as what are called stem cells. You guys probably have heard of stem cells, right? Undifferentiated, don't know what they want to be when they grow up, right? They're not specialized yet. Cells that are undifferentiated, such as those found in infants and fetuses, are much more sensitive to radiation damage because of their lack of differentiation, the lack of specialization. Nerve cells are highly specialized, whereas germ cells, sex cells, are not very specialized until they're completely matured. Okay, so you can say things like the nervous system is the most radio-resistant tissue in the body because the nerve cells are amitotic and they're highly specialized. And you can also say things like the gonads are the most highly radiosensitive tissue in the body. So nervous tissue is the least radiosensitive, most radioresistant. Gonad tissue is the most radiosensitive because the cells are undifferentiated, they're not specialized, and they are highly mitotic. They're constantly dividing. Okay, those two things, the rate of mitosis and the amount of specialization, determine how radiosensitive a body tissue will be. Okay, so with all that said, we measure, because different body tissues are different, we need to know something called the tissue weighting factor. We need to include what type of tissue is being irradiated to determine the overall amount of harm that's going to come from this. So that tissue weighting factor is listed as a capital W subscript T, the relative sensitivity of exposed tissues. All right, all that said, there's the table. So these are going to come up on tests. So they're numbers. Sometimes you have to remember numbers, and here's some numbers. Okay, so cortical bone and skin has a radiation weighting factor of 0.01. So you would take the dose in gray and multiply it by the radiation weighting factor, excuse me, by the tissue weighting factor. Organs in general, tissue weighting factor of 0.05. Notice how we're going up in numbers. Bone marrow, colon, lung, stomach tissue, 0.12. Breast tissue, 0.05. And gonad tissue, 0.2. So whatever, yeah.
I have a question about x-rays. So, if you're taking an x-ray of the upper body, so I know this goes high up as the chest, considering that there's some scatter x-ray, do you still have to cover a person's gonads if the x-ray exposure is all the way up there?
So yeah, we're going to talk in depth about shielding when it comes, but we often put on what's called a lap apron, just a lap shield, and it usually, for a chest x-ray, it's usually placed on the patient's front. But but they're facing away from the X-ray beam. X-ray beam's coming from their back and exiting their front, right? But the shield's in the front of their body. So what you're protecting them from is back scatter radiation coming off of the wall and image receptor. So yeah, you're shielding the gonads, but what you're not doing is you're not using something called gonadal shielding. So that's more specific and is used. Gonadal shielding is a technical term for shielding that is thicker and used in the path of the primary beam, which is a little bit different than scatter shields. So we'll talk in depth about those. But yeah, yes, when you do things like chest x-rays, neck and skull x-rays, for example, you would still be shielding the gonads with a scatter apron. Yep. But yeah, so again, it was more to say there, but yeah, absolutely. Good. All right, so there you go. Yeah, so an example given is they say how much harm is done by a 600 microgray dose of x-rays to the gonads. So you would take that unit, 600 microgray, 600 millionths of a gray, which is very small, and multiply it by the gonad factor, which is 0.2. So 600 times 0.2 is, hopefully, if they did the math right, 120. Okay, and so the effective dose is 120 microgray is an effective dose. It always brings down. Notice all these factors are less than 1, right? Always brings it down. So that's your tissue weighting factors, giving you what's called the effective dose. So to sum it up, you were given air kerma, entrance skin exposure, given in gray. You were given absorbed dose, that was given in gray as well. There's a 1-to-1 relationship there. Okay, absorbed dose equals entrance skin exposure. You were given dose equivalent, which gave you the unit of the sievert. I didn't tell you when we use these yet, but the dose equivalent unit given in sieverts, which takes into account just the type of radiation. And you were next and lastly given the effective dose, which includes the tissue, the type of body tissue that we interact with. So those are our 4 things that we want to be able to measure.